I'm Joanna Piras. This is Paul Tennant, a political science professor from the University of British Columbia. Paul, the relationship between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people in Canada, and most specifically here in British Columbia. Paul, it could be argued that we're all suffering from sort of a collective amnesia when it comes to the history of the relationship between Aboriginals and non-Aboriginals in this country. Why is it important that that situation be rectified?
I think that the issue of Aboriginal claims is one of the few issues where going back to the very beginning is essential to understand what's going on now. I think that's not true with a lot of other issues that are very controversial, where often the facts don't make any difference. This is one where the facts do make a big difference, and very often those who are critical or suspicious do change their mind once they learn what the real situation was in very early times.
Let's go back to those early times. Very early on in the history of what became this country, there were treaties already negotiated with groups east of the Rockies.
Yes, when the British came, both as a matter of expedient self-interest, because they needed to get on with the Indians in a very productive way, but also because of British common law, which recognized the title, the land title of Indigenous people, when British sovereignty was brought to a new territory. So the British laid out a series of instructions to their officials in the proclamation of 1763, which provided for the purchase of Indian land, which of course meant they were recognizing Indian title. So that's where the treaty process came from, and it was applied in the colonies, Canada's, and then west in the prairies before settlement was allowed and before the provinces were established. So in the prairies, for example, the land question was settled before the provinces were created. So once the provinces were there, it was no longer an issue. And of course, it was very different in British Columbia.
In fact, in British Columbia, it was different in such a fundamental way that perhaps that might be the root of the situation we find ourselves in.
Precisely, although the beginnings were quite similar. When the British first established a colony on Vancouver Island, the main official, James Douglas, did recognize Indian title, did purchase land. The legislature did set aside money for the purchase of Indian title. So that's how we began. But then for a variety of reasons, Douglas stopped that policy. He essentially thought that assimilation was the best thing, and you didn't want to leave Indians in their traditional ways on their traditional lands. But still, he was concerned with Indian future, saw them as equal to the whites. But once Douglas retired, the successors, with Joseph Trutch being the main official, had a very different view and began to curtail Indian rights. Douglas had given the Indians land rights, for example, which Trutch denied, didn't allow them to homestead any longer. And in particular, as Douglas never had, Trutch denied the Indians ever had owned the land. So he simply denied what Douglas had done, distorted the meaning of those treaties, said that these were primitive people who'd never thought of themselves as owning the land and should not be seen now as having owned the land. So that was the basis of British Columbia policy from then on right through until 1990, in fact.
Now, at the time of Confederation, why didn't Ottawa exercise the clout to impose a system that had worked well in the rest of the country on British Columbia?
That's a big mystery question, although the answer is certainly partly evident. The officials in Ottawa knew very little about British Columbia. There was no railway, no telegraph in those days. British Columbia officials, led by Trutch himself, went back to Ottawa to negotiate our entry into Confederation, and they basically didn't give Ottawa very much information. Ottawa assumed that treaties had already been signed over most of British Columbia, and indeed they had not. So Ottawa wasn't concerned about title, wasn't concerned about treaties. There was a fair bit of attention to reserves, but that item in the Terms of Union gave the province a veto power over the size and number of reserves, which again was something no other province had. So British Columbia really controlled the show in coming into Confederation as far as Aboriginal peoples were concerned. And of course, they weren't consulted at all.
What was the reaction of the Aboriginal people to be suddenly told, here you are on the land, suddenly someone else comes in and says to you, well, this isn't really yours, here's this little bit you can have?
Shock and surprise, and protest across the province at a local level, but very quickly, especially after they learned of the official denial of title, protest in ever better organized fashion. To the point that by the 1880s there was a very well-developed movement. The chiefs came to Victoria in a delegation. They wanted three things. They wanted recognition of their title, they wanted treaties because they were very willing to share. Sharing has always been part of the rhetoric of Indian claims, willing to share with the newcomers. And thirdly, self-government. They wanted to control their own affairs on their own lands, and for the most part, quite willing to accept British sovereignty, providing they had their land rights and could control their own affairs in their own communities.
There was a time, was there not, where agitating for or pressing for land claims and treaties became illegal?
That's precisely right. Through the first 3 decades of this century, there was ever-increasing agitation by Indians to the point that Ottawa set up a parliamentary committee to look into the British Columbia land claims. And the claims were made very forcefully in Ottawa by British Columbia Indian leaders. But in the end, the committee, which was dominated by MPs from British Columbia, dismissed the claims, said they were the work of white agitators. The Indians themselves could never have thought of this notion of owning their own land. And so to prevent them from wasting their time and money, the Indian Act was amended to make land claim activities illegal without the permission of the government. So they couldn't hire lawyers, they couldn't buy postage stamps. And from 1927 until 1951, there was no land claim activity because it was illegal. And that, of course, meant they could not get their claim into court. And that was what really worried the government, that they'd get to court, especially to London, where the courts were basically sympathetic to Aboriginal title. And indeed, had the BC claim got to London, the Indians might well have won in London, but they were prevented from doing that.
Ultimately, that law was lifted. And
right.
what happened? What happened then?
As soon as the law was lifted in the early 50s, they started up where they stopped in 1927. And we had organization on the coast under Frank Calder to a large extent, and the interior under George Manuel. They made the same claims again. They resorted now to the ordinary democratic process, to lobbying, to making speeches, to petitioning Parliament and the British Columbia legislature. It didn't work. Nothing happened. They were being ignored when they were using the very processes that were supposed to lead to, to good decision-making to democracy. It simply didn't occur here in British Columbia.
As a matter of fact, we have a piece of archival footage from that period doing all those things that lobbyists do, appearing on open-line radio shows as well. Let's take a look at that.
Hold on, I'll put you on air. Don't go away. You want to talk about Indians and the land problem? Go ahead, please.
Mr. Calder, don't the spoils of war go to the victor? In any country in this world, you would never have been looked after the way you have been here. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I'd just like to remind the lady that in this province, the Indian people were never conquered. We were the owners, and Sir Francis Drake recognized that we were the owners of this land. And the following imperial statutes, right up to 1861, all recognized in writing that this was Indian territory.
So therefore it was only British Columbia and the federal government at the time of Confederation which really double-crossed you.
In 1866, the then government in Victoria made the first issue that we were not the owners of the land. And they made it stronger when they wrote the BNA Act, see? When they wrote the Constitution. That the provinces own the land and we don't. And this is what we're testing on this writ.
Frank Calder was in that scene with Jack Webster, dealing with very common misperceptions that Indians are a conquered people and have been dealt with very charitably by the rest of us. And of course that attitude, those approaches simply no longer work. But what Calder and his other Nisga'a leaders were doing at that very time in the mid-60s was proceeding with political organization, and they had created in 1955 a new version of a political organization, namely the Nisga'a Tribal Council. And in that council, both Calder and James Gosnell were very prominent. And James Gosnell was one who set out really what their problems were and why it wasn't working in terms of simply talking to government.
We have another piece of tape where James Gosnell displays the level of frustration that was being felt by everyone, I think, at the time. Let's look at that.
Now the floor is open for comments, your opinion, and questions.
Mr. Chairman, this is the 10th annual convention of the Nisga'a Tribal Council. That's 10 conventions now we have taken. No result. No action. No action. Waiting. That's the reason why I said in that meeting, I'll make a motion, Mr. Chairman. I said that we go now. We want to get the settlement once and for all now, not another 100 years from now. We're not going to sit here and allow the white men to use and to make fun of us in this land of ours. We've been sitting here, take a look around you. There's people in New York now getting rich over my country. Our mountains are getting stripped. Everything is taken away from us. And I think I can say that, and excuse my language, we are getting fed up. I'm getting fed up. I went last year where my father and I used to trap across here. There isn't a tree left there. If it wasn't those animals at that time, I wouldn't have been standing here. This is what hurts me. I want that to be clearly understood. It hurts me deeply. When I said to George, don't sing that song anymore, I meant it, George. Because this is my land. I want the settlement now. I thank you.
In that speech, Gosnell was expressing nothing new. In fact, in the 1870s and 1890s, his grandfather and Frank Calder's grandfather had been saying much the same things to the provincial government. As you can see, they were getting very frustrated by the mid-60s. And it was as a result of that, they, as the first in British Columbia, turned to the courts.
Let's take a look at a little bit of archival footage. We have Frank Calder talking about his point of view about taking things to the courts.
The Nisga'a Tribal Council isn't on trial. The Nazaré people are not on trial in this issue. The Indians in British Columbia are not on trial. British justice is on trial. British justice is on trial. I believe that British justice will prevail. And if it does not prevail, the Indians in British Columbia will be prepared to go to The Hague, the court of law world over, if not even to the United Nations. We're not going to stop. We're not going to be defeated.
Frank Calder's statement is very revealing because, as is often not realized, what the Aboriginal peoples of BC have been doing is expecting British law, Canadian law, to be implemented. The claim has been, you, the British authorities, you, the Canadian authorities, have not followed your own laws. So in that sense, it was British justice on trial, not the Nisga'a. And so often they have to be, in effect, on trial to prove their case. And that's a very different situation from what I think should be the case. So it was British law that in the end, of course, would recognize title as it now has in this province.
It was also the courts that provided a certain amount of political will or impetus.
Very definitely, because beginning in the 1980s, when really nothing had happened in British Columbia as a result of the court cases, a round of protests began, beginning with Mears Island, going on to other places, in which Indian groups would blockade against resource development in claim areas, non-reserved claim areas, of course fully authorized by the province. The courts were brought in the sense that both the protesters and the companies would want to stop the activities of the other. And in fact, the courts sided with the protesters, with the Indian groups, saying that until the claim is dealt with, we will not allow resource extraction to go ahead because that would destroy the very basis of what is being claimed. And so that, which began with the Mears Island situation, was, I think, the real body blow to the province. Once the courts were saying you can't exercise your authority in areas, really, what could the province do? It was a loss of face, it was a loss of power, and it was a creation of great economic uncertainty. The companies came to want a settlement, came to want some certainty. And so indirectly, through those injunctions in the 1980s, the courts in BC compelled the province to negotiate. It was the province's own decision. It was the Van der Zalm government's decision in 1990 to go ahead, provoked by some further protests in the summer of 1990. But essentially it was the courts, I think, that left the province no choice. And those who were opposed to claim action now should realize that the courts would return to those injunctions if there were further protests, as there surely would be, if the process were not to continue.
So the courts essentially put it back in the government's face and said, you have to deal with this because this is your job. So the decision was then made, fine, the government will get into a process of negotiation. So describe that process for me.
What has happened in the last 4 years is, of course, of critical importance. Everywhere else in Canada and most places in the world where treaties were entered into with Indigenous peoples, the government set the agenda, provided the funding, was really in control of the process. In British Columbia, for the first time ever, the Aboriginal participants of the future treaty process were able to take part in establishing that process. In 1990, after meetings with both governments, a tripartite task force was established with Indian, provincial, and federal representatives to recommend a process. They gave their report in 1991 recommending the process that we now have starting, in fact. And key to that process was a treaty commission which would oversee the process, not do any negotiating, but oversee the process, the keeper of the process, as the slogan came to be. That was brand new, an impartial overseer of the process. And that is, of course, where we are today.
Are there other contemporary treaties that we can look at to compare the way the process works?
Very definitely. As a result of the Nishka case in 1973 and the federal government changing their policy, a whole series of treaties were entered into in northern Canada and northern Quebec. And essentially, I think those treaties are models for what will happen in BC. The situations are different, but still, as a general model, those are the same. The only real difference is that the BC treaties are going to include self-government, as the northern treaties do not in a formal way.
So we're up to date.
We're up to date.
Thank you very much, Paul.
You're welcome, Joanna.